Welcome to the 100 Men Small Group Leader Orientation. This orientation is comprised of 3 modules, including Domestic and Sexual Violence 101, Primary Prevention 101, and Why Men and Why 100 Men. These modules are designed to educate you on the basics of violence, how we can prevent it, and what role you have to play in moving our community and society to a violence-free and equitable environment for all people. Seeing as this is Prevail's 100 Men, we first want to start off this orientation with a little bit of information about Prevail. Prevail was founded in July of 1986 to meet the needs of victims of crime and abuse in Hamilton County. Prevail's mission statement is to empower victims of crime and abuse on their path to healing while engaging the community to support safe, healthy relationships. All services Prevail provides are free, confidential, and open to anyone. Prevail services include 24/7 crisis intervention through a hotline, support groups for kids, teens, and adults, individual appointments, self-sufficiency services, support through ongoing court cases, and assisting with the filing of protective orders. Prevail also has prevention programming, which we will discuss at length in Module 2. It's also important to know that Prevail helps anyone who has been impacted by crime or abuse. This includes domestic or dating violence, sexual assault, harassment, stalking, or any other violent crime. We also see children, adolescents, and adults, as well as secondary victims. Secondary victims are those who have been impacted by another person's victimization, like, for example, parents of children who have been sexually abused. We believe that in order to prevent violence, it's critical to understand the nature of domestic and sexual violence. So domestic violence is a pattern of behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. Much of the misconception about domestic violence is that it's primarily physically abusive. However, we know that abuse can take on a lot of different forms, including sexual, emotional, financial, psychological, spiritual abuse, and all of these forms can also be facilitated through technology. On this slide, we have what is called the power and control wheel. It's important to note that this wheel contains language referring to the victim as she and her. Now, while the majority of victims of domestic violence are women, we know that violence can happen to anyone. Anyone can be victimized, and anyone can be an abuser or perpetrator. Now, this wheel is meant to show how power and control are yielded in relationships. Each section contains examples of what an abuser may do to assert power and control over their victim. Take a moment and read through the examples of this wheel. You may pause this video to read. After reading through the examples, I challenge you to think about why a victim might stay in an abusive relationship. Leaving an abusive relationship is much more difficult than most would think. Victims often feel conflicted between caring for this person, but also wanting the abuse to stop. Victims are typically isolated and without much power, making it more difficult to get the courage to leave. Now that you understand how power and control are used in abusive relationships, I want you to review this equality wheel. The equality wheel is used to show what a relationship needs to be equal, fair, and healthy. The Domestic Violence Informative Booklet contains a more in-depth look at the topics you see listed here. This booklet will be sent to you via email to read through. So now we will be switching gears to discussing the basics of sexual violence. So sexual violence, sexual assault, harassment, misconduct, these are all terms that usually get thrown around and most people don't quite understand what each term entails. So sexual assault is any sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of that person. This can include something like groping a woman over her clothes without permission. It can also include molestation, rape, or attempted rape. Now, coercion is a technique. It's using things like trickery, manipulation, emotional and physical pressure, or using drugs and alcohol to get someone to agree to sexual contact. Coercion is illegal because consent must be something a person gives freely, because they want to be saying yes, not because they're being tricked, forced, guilt-tripped, or drugged. Now, harassment is considered unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. Sexual harassment was a hot-button topic during the Me Too movement, and the reason being sexual harassment is obviously illegal in the workplace. Under laws like Title VII, sexual harassment is prohibited, particularly in the workplace, and this law addresses 2 types of harassment: quid pro quo and hostile work environment. Sexual harassment and sexual violence overall is deemed illegal in schools under Title IX, which prohibits discrimination against a person based on their sex or gender, which also includes sexual harassment, rape, or assault. Lastly, sexual violence is more of an umbrella term that is usually used to include some of the terms that we just covered and often more. It's important to note that these definitions are non-legal. Every state has their own definition of different sex crimes and their own definition of consent. When talking about sexual violence, it's important to know that victims of sexual violence experience a myriad of emotions after an assault. It is critical that we understand that when interacting with a survivor of sexual violence, no interaction is neutral. It's either going to be healing or wounding, meaning we must choose our words and actions really carefully. So saying things like, "I'm sorry this happened," "It's not your fault," "You're not alone," and "I believe you," are all extremely healing phrases to say. On the other hand, avoid questioning the person about what happened or what they're going to do about it. Survivors of abuse can react to their trauma in a myriad of ways. Often, trauma makes it difficult for a person to make decisions, remember things, or sometimes even think rationally. Another common thing about abuse trauma is that people don't often disclose their abuse right away. It may take years for somebody to be able to talk about it. The last portion of this module is the Sexual Assault Informative Booklet. Similar to the Domestic Violence Booklet, this one contains more information about sexual assault on the topics you see listed. Please read through this booklet, which will be sent to you via email before moving on to Module 2, Primary Prevention 101.